Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In section 4 of his article, God's John Wisdom is going to take up a line of thought, of analysis, of what it is that these sort of questions about gods really entail. How would we go about resolving them? How can we even frame them properly? And he's going to note that there's more than one source of these questions. And he's going to begin by framing it very generally. The question, is belief in gods reasonable? So, can a reasonable person going about by reasonable means that might actually be convincing to another reasonable person express and explain why they believe in gods in such a way that could be convincing for another person? Now, what is involved in this? He makes it very clear that what he's talking about here is not just whether there's an entity that we call a god, but belief in divine minds. And he says it's clear that in order to grasp fully the logic of belief in divine minds, we need to examine the logic of belief in animal and human minds, but we can't do that here. So for the purposes of this discussion about divine minds, let us acknowledge the reasonableness of our belief in human minds without troubling ourselves about its logic. Then there's a question that arises. And so here's how he frames it. The question of the reasonableness of belief in divine minds becomes a matter of this other question: whether there are facts in nature which support claims about divine minds in the way facts in nature support our claims about human minds. So we're going to carry out a kind of argument by analogy if we're arguing for, or we might also be doing it by disanalogy if we're arguing against in terms of this question. And what's really interesting about this is that wisdom pulls the old Aristotle switcheroo. And I'm saying this kind of facetiously because Aristotle at different points in his works will say, there are two of this, and by the way, there's also a third. And that is what wisdom does here. So questions about human minds, also about animal minds as well, as he's going to talk about here, they have two components, right? He says, we resolve the force behind the problem of the existence of gods into two components. One of these is metaphysical, and one of them is empirical or scientific, or however you want to frame it. And so he's going to say, is there any ever behavior which gives reason to believe in any sort of mind? So, this is why we're talking about human minds. Do we actually think that we have human minds? And then we can say, are there other mind patterns in nature besides the human and animal patterns, which we can all easily detect? And are these other mind patterns superhuman? And so he's going to say, this is an overdetermination, right? What does it mean to be overdetermined? It means that there's more to a linguistic or semantic, or however you want to frame it, entity than we can easily account for. It could be ambiguous. It could be capable of multiple interpretations, connotations, right? There's more going on there. Why is that the case for what he's describing? So he goes on and he says, overdetermination of a question syndrome, which is kind of a cool turn of phrase, right? Wisdom is thinking of this kind of along the lines that people will talk about Wittgenstein. This is a puzzle that is significant of a confusion. So what's going on? He says these puzzling questions, like do dogs think or do animals feel, are partly metaphysical puzzles and partly scientific questions. And notice that he chose two different terms there, puzzles and questions. They're not all metaphysical questions and or scientific questions, so that they're all questions and one is just over here and the other's over here. They're kind of different in kind, but they're all rolled up in one. So he's going to give us a walkthrough of this. He says they're not purely metaphysical. Why? Because we can look at what people have to say from their experiences. The reports of scientists about the poor performances of cats in cages. It's already known back then that cats don't cooperate well with scientists who design their experiments in heavy-handed ways. And old ladies' stories about the remarkable performances of their pets. These are not irrelevant. These are actually relevant, but do they solve the question? He says, no, these are not purely scientific. The stories never settle them, nor do experiments. And we have other sources. One is the metaphysical source we've already noticed, the difficulty about getting behind an animal's behavior to its mind, whether it is a non-human animal or a human one. So we've already got a complicated question. And then we get, but there's a third thing. And he's going to talk about this third thing at greater length, because this is going to turn out to be really vital to wisdom's point of view on these matters. So he says, there's a third component in the force behind these questions. These disputes have a third source. What is it? We have to kind of unpack it from this. It is one which is important in the dispute, which finds expression in the words, I believe in God, I do not. Two different opposed sides. And he says the source comes out well if we consider a different question. Do flowers feel? Like the questions about dogs and animals, this question about flowers comes partly from the difficulty we sometimes feel over inference from any behavior to thought or feeling, and partly from ignorance as to what behavior could be found. So, difficulty over the inference, going from one thing to another. Can we apply the same reasoning, the same logic as we use for human beings and perhaps for animals to flowers? That's one question. And then ignorance. We don't know what plants feel, if they feel anything. We can certainly do measurements of stuff, but do those correlate to states of consciousness or feeling? We don't know. Right? We could say, they definitely don't. Well, that's going too far, isn't it? We don't know in a lot of cases. So he goes on and he says that these questions, as opposed to a like question about human beings, also come from hesitation as to whether the behavior in question is enough mind-like. Is it similar enough or superior to human behavior to be mind-proving? Is there a mind pattern there, right? And so when we think about gods, can we call these manifestations of a divine being? So there's a hesitation over enough, not whether it's yes or no, but where it fits into the gradient, the spectrum, the continuum. Analogies are never perfect, but we still rely on them all the time. So, do we have enough to say yes or no? And he's going to suggest that somebody might come along and say, here's the confusion. You are trying to figure out whether a name can apply to this or not. Do flowers feel? Are flowers, this thing that we know, in the domain of things that actually have feelings? Which we kind of know a bit, but maybe not that well. And so should we apply that name, feeling, to flowers? Or should we say, yes, a divine mind exists, or divine minds? Or should we say, no, we can say definitively they don't exist? And so we can ask, okay, well, what's in a name? And wisdom says, well, nothing. And also very much. And sometimes it's something in between. And this very much, like he says, has more than one source. And then he brings up a lot of interesting examples. So the one about Abelard and Eloise. Okay, so if you don't know that story, Eloise and Abelard were two very brilliant scholars. They screwed around while they were supposed to be studying together. He was her tutor, being hired by her uncle in Paris because he was like, the best philosopher in Paris at the time. She gets pregnant. They flee. They get married. Her uncle has him castrated by his men. And now they are still married, but, Abelard says, well, I got to become a monk. You got to become a nun. Their son, Astrolabe, goes off with Abelard's sister in Brittany. And now, Abelard is going to eventually write the history of his calamities. And Eloise will read it and she'll be like, hey, man, you should have contacted me. By the way, I'm going to write you a letter. We're still married, even though you're a monk and I'm a nun and we can't copulate or anything like that. We can still have married love. And so somebody could come along and say, it isn't that Abelard no longer loves you. This man isn't Abelard. He's no longer the person who he was. That name no longer applies to him. And wisdom is going to provide us with some other interesting examples where it's not just saying, oh, you got it wrong. It's a genuine question. He says, we might have said to poor Mr. Tebrick and Mr. Garnet's lady into fox, but this is no longer Sylvia. And now we get something new. What if Mr. Tebrick, whose lady has turned into a fox, were to say, oh, but it is. She is still Sylvia. The question is, does this name apply to this different creature who is no longer a human woman, but instead, I suppose you would say, a vixen, right? A fox. Or we could talk about this interesting passage that we have about the narrator talking with his friend Bill and, having a sort of controversy about whether he and his wife are happy. So the narrator says, I think Kay and I are pretty happy. And Bill says, would you mind saying that all again? And he says, I don't see what's so weird about it. Kay and I have really been happy. And Bill says, okay, tell me how you and Kay have been happy. And he says, it's a little hard to explain. It's like taking a lot of numbers that don't look alike and don't mean anything until you add them all together. And Bill says, okay, what about those numbers? And the narrator says, all the things that two people do together, two people like Kay and me, add up to something. There are the kids and the house and the dog and all the people we've known and all the times we've been out to dinner. Of course, we do quarrel sometimes, but when you add it all together, all of it isn't as bad as the parts of it seem. That's all there is to anybody's life, right? So Bill clearly doesn't think they're happy. The narrator clearly does think they're happy. They're looking at the same stuff, the same facts, but they're interpreting them in different ways. And then wisdom goes on and says, we could generalize this. Any two people who are speaking about two characters, say in a novel, or two friends, two of their friends in their life. Both of them know them, and one says, really, she hated him, and the other says, she didn't, she loved him. How can they come to different conclusions like this? Well, there's an explanation. The first may have noticed what the other has not, although he knows no incident in the lives of the people they're talking about, which the other doesn't know too. And the second speaker may say, she didn't, she loved him, because he hasn't noticed what the first noticed, though he can remember every incident the first can remember. Why? They've noticed patterns. So it's not just pure subjective interpretation or feels or vibes or whatever people like to talk about these days. There's some explanation that can be given. You can point at stuff and say, I see these things according to this sort of pattern. A pattern, by the way, is going to be analogous to other similar patterns, right? So if we can do this with whether people love or hate each other, whether they're happy or not, whether they are the same person or not, we could do this with other things as well, could we not? And so he says, the line between using a name because of how we feel and because of what we noticed isn't that sharp. It's not a pure distinction. And we want to go back a little bit to something else that he said about this. It is possible to have before one's eyes all the items of a pattern and still to miss the pattern. Or perhaps to see a different pattern than the other person sees. Love is one pattern. Hate is another pattern. Happiness, a pattern. Misery, another pattern. This is this person, albeit in fox shape. This is a different thing, different patterns there. Now, we could say this about the universe, going back to this question. Are there facts in nature which support claims about divine minds in the way that facts in nature support claims about human minds? We can look at the same facts in nature, the same universe that we experience, and of course there's all sorts of metaphysical assumptions, as we saw, built in, and draw different conclusions from them. Now, the implication of this, as we're going to see drawn out here, is that these questions have three different important components. One can be understood as metaphysical, the other can be understood as experiential or scientific, and there's a third component which has to do with how we grasp, how we recognize, how we attribute patterns, meanings, if you like, to the things in front of us. And so this is going to have some really important implications for the question, do gods exist? Is belief in gods reasonable?